So I would like to welcome all of you, dear colleagues, to our second issue of our ConTrust speaker series. If you are unsure whether you're in the right Zoom link, you are when you are interested in how, even in context of conflict, trust could be generated or at least stabilized, because this is the main question that ConTrust is posing and is trying to do research on. We're very, very happy to have Nicholas Wheeler today with us. He's a professor for international relations at the University of Birmingham, and he's also co-editor of the Cambridge Studies in International Relations book series. He's also an associate editor of the Journal of Trust Research, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and a member of the United Nations Association of the United Kingdom's Policy Advisory Committee. Nicholas has done his PhD on the origins of the British nuclear strategy at the University of Southampton. Then he became a postdoc at King's College, served as a lecturer at the University of Hull before joining the University of Aberystwyth, a very difficult word for German tongue, where he stayed for, I think, almost 20 years or even 20 years. He directed there the Davis Memorial Institute of International Studies, and now as a professor at the University of Birmingham. He's also director of the newly established Institute for Conflict, Cooperation, Security. With these two issues, conflict and trust, he is obviously a most welcome colleague to be here with us and tell us about his research on trust. He's talking today about trusting enemies, and he said he would start with trust and end, I think, with distrust. So we are very eager to hear your thoughts on that. And please, Nick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nicole. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this evening and to have an opportunity to present some ideas from my work on trust. I'm just sorry I'm not with you in person. It would have been really nice to come over and to got to know you and had a drink and all those nice things that we used to do. But hopefully at some point I'll get a chance to come out and engage with the project. I want to begin by thanking Tobias for inviting me to speak, and Raina and Nicole for inviting me to join the advisory board of the project. So I'm very much looking forward to being part of it going forward. I think the research sounds fascinating. As someone who's been trying to draw trust researchers together across disciplines, I guess for over a decade now, I started that work in Aberystwyth back in the late 2000s. I'm very excited to see what your project does working in this interdisciplinary space, where I think it's really important to operate when we think about trust. And for me, from the beginning, it was always trying to think about what non-international relations trust research could bring to the challenges of trust building at the international level, and equally what focusing on trust at the international level could bring to thinking about trust more generally in the social sciences and humanities. So if I may, I'd like to share my screen. I think I've been made co-host. Yeah, looks like it. Is that okay, everybody? Great. So what I want to do in the next 45 minutes or so is explore with you the challenge of how to develop trust in adversarial relationships. And that was the key subject of my 2018 book, Trusting Enemies, which I've advertised on the front of my slide. And I'm going to divide my remarks into 4 parts. First of all, I want to discuss the goals of the book. Secondly, I want to focus on the key rationalist approach in the international relations literature, the theory of costly signaling, that's advanced as a way of developing trust between 2 adversaries. And I want to use that approach to show its limitations. And then I want to develop a rival theory as to how trust develops between 2 adversaries that I call bonding trust. The idea that trust emerges out of a process of social bonding, social interaction. And finally, I'll talk about some of the directions that the research has taken since the publication of the book, particularly my work with the American scholar Marcus Holmes, who I'm currently writing a book with. The key takeaway from my lecture is that existing theories of trust do not adequately explain how to develop trust in enemy relationships. And it's important to recognize the potential of interpersonal relationships, what Gorbachev called the human factor, in developing trust and transforming conflicts. Now, I thought I'd like to start with this quote from George Schultz. 2 days after Schultz passed his 100th birthday milestone, and 2 months or so roughly before he passed away, he wrote this wonderful article in the Washington Post, the 10 most important things I've learned about trust. And this opening line, I think, is fantastic. I'm struck that there is one lesson I learned early and then relearned over and over. Trust is the coin of the realm. When trust was in the room, whatever room that was, the family room, the school room, the locker room, the office room, the government room, or the military room, good things happened. When trust was not in the room, good things did not happen. Everything else is details. I think that's a wonderful reflection from someone, of course, who played such a pivotal role in navigating the superpowers out of the Cold War alongside Ronald Reagan. And I think it's one that we should come back to. So let me start then with the goals of my book. The first goal of Trusting Enemies is to develop a new theory of how trust can develop in adversarial security relations. I agree with Robert Cohen that social science should always start with a puzzle. Good social science research, I tell my students, should start with a puzzle, and I try and get them to think about what a puzzle is in their own work. The fundamental empirical puzzle that motivated my book was, how did the US-Soviet relationship go from Ronald Reagan calling the Soviet Union an evil empire in 1983 to US and Soviet leaders making peace in the second half of the 1980s? How important was trust to this transformation? And if it was important, how did it emerge between the leaders of two enemy states? In thinking about how trust can develop in an anarchic international system, my starting point is the concept of the security dilemma. The latter can be defined, as Ken Booth and I did in our 2008 book, The Security Dilemma, Fear, Cooperation and Trust in World Politics, as the inescapable or unresolvable uncertainty that confronts one particular set of decision makers about the intentions of another set of decision makers that have the military capabilities to harm them. The starting point for security dilemma theorizing is the claim that two states may have peaceful intent, but they're unable to signal this to each other because each believes the other has malign intent. As a result, they find themselves trapped in a spiral of security competition that is driven at root by misperceptions of each other's intentions. Robert Jervis, the theorist, of course, who's made the greatest contribution to our understanding of the security dilemma, calls this the spiral model in his classic 1976 book, Perception and Misperception in International Politics, a book that I still, 40 years after I first read it, still go back to and benefit from every time. And Booth and I refer to this type of competition as security dilemma dynamics. Now, it's important to enter a caveat here. The power of the security dilemma idea in international relations is that ultimately we can never know, at the time or later, whether a particular conflict is driven by spiral model dynamics. The problem is that there can be no objective way of knowing for certain whether another state has malign or peaceful intent, and indeed whether they will develop that in the future. And there will be cases, some would argue that Vladimir Putin's Russia today, or perhaps the behavior of the Chinese government in relation to COVID-19, and more widely, where distrust and not trust is the right response. As the moral philosopher Honora O'Neill reminds us, we should only trust the trustworthy. But there are other cases where misplaced fear and suspicion drives conflict. The conundrum that confronts decision makers, and indeed the rest of us, but it's decision makers who hold the fates of nations in their hands as they navigate the security dilemma, is deciding whether a particular conflict is driven by misperceptions of each other's peaceful intent, or alternatively, whether another state has malign intent and should be actively distrusted and deterred. At the heart of the security dilemma argument is the claim that two states might have peaceful intent, but fail to appreciate this, resulting in both sides mistakenly imputing malign intent to the other, leading to escalating military security competition. Jervis's spiral model that I mentioned a moment ago is predicated on the idea that if both sides properly understood one another's peaceful intentions, then both sides could make themselves secure without making the other insecure. This leads into the second goal of the book, which is to make a contribution to the literature on how two states with peaceful intent can signal this to each other. And I aim to do this by developing a new trust-based theory of accurate signal interpretation. Why is this important? It's important, of course, because one of the biggest obstacles to cooperation in international relations is the problem that actors who send signals believe that others will interpret their signals as they intend. Whereas the problem is that often the receiver of a signal does not interpret it as intended by the sender. IR theory has recognized this problem of the ambiguity of signal interpretation for a long time, most notably in Jervis's pioneering work, especially his 1970 book, The Logic of Images in International Relations, which a little more later. However, we lack good theories of how this ambiguity may be overcome. And I aim to supply a new one. I argue that a particular type of interpersonal trust, which I call bonding trust, cuts through the problem of how to interpret signals accurately. This type of deep interpersonal trust emerges between two leaders or top-level decision makers, giving each the assurance that they can trust in the intent and integrity of the person they have formed what I call a relationship of bonded trust with. Put differently, this type of interpersonal trust is causally prior to the accurate interpretation of signals between two state leaders. The third goal of the book is to apply the theory of bonding trust to 3 cases of interpersonal interaction and trust-non-trust emergence. In terms of case selection, I selected my cases on the basis of the following 2 considerations. First, cases where we see sincere attempts by one or both sides to signal their peaceful intent. And second, cases where there was the presence or the absence of face-to-face interaction. My 3 cases are Reagan-Gorbachev interactions and the transformation of US-Soviet relations in the second half of the 1980s, the empirical puzzle that motivated me when I first started working on this book. The interactions between the Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee and his Pakistani counterpart Nawaz Sharif, and the trust-building process between India and Pakistan in the aftermath of both sides developing nuclear weapons in late 1998, and the breakdown of trust as a result of the Kargil War in May 1999. And finally, interactions between Obama and Ali Khamenei in the context of the failure of Obama's trust-building strategy with regard to Iran's nuclear program in the first Obama administration. In terms of social science research design, the case selection is aimed at ensuring variation on the dependent variable, which in my research design is accurate, inaccurate signal interpretation, and the independent variable, which is face-to-face interaction. Let me start then with the limitations of costly signaling as a theory of accurate signal interpretation. Costly signaling theory is predicated on the idea that if a signal is made costly enough, then this provides the receiver of the signal with credible information about a state's peaceful intentions. The best example of this type of theorizing in IR, and with trust at the center of the analysis, is of course Andrew Kidd's work. For Kidd, Trust is a belief about the preferences of another state such that they will reciprocate and not exploit cooperation. Kidd calls this assurance gain preferences because all actors want is an assurance that others will cooperate before they will make and reciprocate cooperative moves themselves. Kidd contrasts this with what he calls prisoner's dilemma preferences, where states look to exploit cooperative moves and make gains at others' expense. We might ask, based on this schema, where we would locate Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Biden, for example. Are they assurance gain or prisoner's dilemma players? And does this vary depending on the issue area? The assumption behind the costly signaling approach is that actors can be assumed to have peaceful intent, and they seek to communicate their trustworthiness to others who are uncertain about their intentions by making limited cooperative moves. And if these cooperative moves are reciprocated, then trust builds up, and the initiating actor can then send costlier signals based on the development of that trust. A costly signal is defined as one that would be hard for an actor with malign intent to fake, and hence it communicates credible information about the actor's type, whether it's peaceful or malign, to another state. Costly signals are contrasted by rationalist scholars like Kidd with what they view as other costless forms of communication that are pejoratively labelled as cheap talk. The argument is that an actor who behaves in a way that carries no cost, whether she is trustworthy or untrustworthy, provides no credible information about her type as either having peaceful or malign intent. By contrast, a costly signal is one that an actor would not send if they had aggressive intent. Kidd argues that the application of costly signaling theory to an adversarial relationship, where both states have assurance gain preferences, can lead to a growth of trust through the reciprocation of ever costlier signals, leading to a breakthrough in the conflict. It's important to note that Kidd sees costly signals as dependent on the prior growth of trust through rounds of reciprocated cooperation. But he also sees that trust growing as the virtuous circle of reciprocated costly signaling develops. Now, there are two key problems with the costly signaling approach. First, it doesn't adequately explain how one or both adversaries who are in a relationship of distrust come to send what they perceive as a signal of their trustworthiness in a context where they might well fear that this would be interpreted as a trick or a sign of weakness that will be exploited. Put differently, how does cooperation get started in the first place? The second problem is that even if one side is able to send what they view as a costly signal, there is the problem of whether this will be interpreted by the receiver as intended by the sender. I want to focus on the second problem, but we do need to bear in mind the first problem when thinking about how actors reach a position where they might be willing to send what they believe is a costly signal. Now, with regard to the problem of how a receiver interprets what a sender believes as a costly signal, the example on this slide, of course, highlights the problem of accurate signal interpretation. This is Anwar Sadat, of course, after taking his courageous decision in November 1977 to visit the capital of his arch-enemy, Israel, and break with his fellow Arab leaders by publicly recognizing the state of Israel in a groundbreaking speech before the Israeli Knesset. He's being greeted here, of course, by Begin at the airport in Tel Aviv. But there's no evidence that Begin perceived the move as the breakthrough signal that Sadat had intended. Why is this? My answer is that Begin was operating with what the US political psychologist Ol Holsty called an inherent bad faith model of an adversary. Holsty built his theory of the inherent bad faith model out of an empirical study of how US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles responded to what many historians would argue was Nikita Khrushchev's conciliatory outreach in the mid-1950s. Dulles believed that the Soviet leopard could never change its spots, and that what appeared to be conciliatory moves were in fact the Soviet Union seeking a breathing space while it built itself up for the next round of strategic competition. The same argument that some American policymakers would make in relation to Mikhail Gorbachev in the second half of the 1980s. That the Soviet Union was just seeking a breathing space while it built itself up to strike back again. Dulles believed that Khrushchev was making these moves from a position of weakness that had been generated by US strength. And the last thing the United States should do was let up on those pressures. Dulles was operating, Holsti argued, with an inherent bad faith model of Soviet intentions, rooted in a belief that the communist state was committed to the destruction of Western values and interests. It's bad faith models of this kind that lead receivers to interpret what senders believe are costly signals as tricks intended to lure them into a false sense of security. Now, a good example of this problem is, of course, the relationship between Obama and Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Obama tried a significant outreach to Iran in his first term, but this was rejected by the supreme leader. Khamenei asked Obama for a stronger signal and discounted the limited US moves as Obama playing to the gallery rather than a serious commitment to ending the conflict. But it was Iran's rejection of the US outreach which played into the hands of US hardliners like Secretary of State Clinton, who argued that Iran's actions showed that it could not be trusted. The bad faith model motivating Clinton at the time is captured in the later reflection of Gary Seymour, who was Obama's White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction. He told me in an interview that I conducted with him in 2014, quote, "The longer you deal with the Iranians on the nuclear issue, the more you get sick and tired of their games and lies and cheating." And you can imagine that the current challenges with Iran and the US over the nuclear issue would be generating those kind of sentiments on both sides at the moment, based on, I think, the talks this week that they were having and the difficulties they were encountering there. The problem here, though, is that Seymour is not prepared to recognize how far US behavior might have conditioned the Iranian behavior he is so critical of. I would argue that what Seymour is showing here is a failure to understand the security dilemma problem. And what he's exhibiting is a psychological bias that Ken Booth and I called a peaceful defensive self-image in our 2008 book. Decision makers who exhibit this psychological mindset, a peaceful defensive self-image, find it extraordinarily difficult to recognize how their own actions might have made others fearful and insecure. I've given the example here of what Caspar Weinberger, Reagan's Secretary of Defense, speaking in March 1983 in response to Soviet claims that Reagan's plans to develop a space-based defense system, the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative. Speaking in response to Soviet claims that this would threaten the viability of the Soviet nuclear deterrent, Weinberger said, "They know perfectly well that we will never launch a first strike on the Soviet Union." Here, Weinberg illustrates the peaceful defensive self-image, an inability to understand that the Soviet Union might not be reassured by those kind of claims and would look to US capabilities and perceive those as threatening. The problem is, Soviet leaders could not see, because Soviet leaders could not see inside the minds of their US counterparts, they had no such assurance of US peaceful intentions. This is why the security dilemma is such a fundamentally important concept in the field of international relations, because it makes us aware of how a conflict can be driven by mutual fear and suspicion, rather than bad faith actions on one side only. An inherent bad faith model is one symptom of what is known in the literature as an enemy image, and a peaceful defensive self-image is a further symptom. I define an enemy image as a belief that another state has shown by its actions that it has hostile intent. It cannot be trusted to keep agreements. Conciliatory moves are either a trick or a sign of weakness, and security lies in developing countervailing military capabilities. Now, it might be responded that all that is needed to overcome the possibility that a receiver is operating with biased interpretations of an adversary is to make the signal even costlier. This was Charlie Glaser's rationalist response to the criticism of costly signaling theory in his 2010 book, Rational Theory of International Politics. Glaser doesn't talk about trust in that book, but he does talk about costly signaling. And he argued that if we could make the signals costly enough, then this would convey credibility. But if existing signals aimed at signaling peaceful intent have already been dismissed by the other side because they're operating with an inherent bad faith model, how easy is it for state leaders to secure policy legitimacy for sending even costlier signals? The example of Obama's outreach shows the difficulty of sustaining this type of signaling, even when it comes to limited, low-level moves, let alone very costly signals. Obama very quickly had to give up his outreach when there was no Iranian reciprocation. This is why Trita Parsi titled his first book on Obama's Iran policy, A Single Roll of the Dice. All Obama had was a single roll of the dice. To summarize then, costly signaling theory does not provide a good explanation of how states can signal their peaceful intent to an adversary because of the problem of signal interpretation. I develop a new theory of accurate signal interpretation in trusting enemies that is predicated on the claim, as I say, that the development of trust is causally prior to accurate signal interpretation. The theory, which I call bonding trust, is predicated on the claim that interpersonal trust can emerge out of a process of social bonding that is made possible by face-to-face interaction. So, a change of gears now. Let's talk about trust directly. So here I've put, I'm sure, two very familiar definitions of trust on the slide. The Russo et al. One, which I think is the most widely cited definition in the cross-disciplinary literature. Trust is a psychological state comprising the intention to accept vulnerability based upon positive expectations of the intentions or behavior of another. And then the Mayer one, which I think is probably almost the second most widely cited, distinguishing between trust as a willingness to assume risk and behavioral trust, the actual assuming of risk. So the argument that trust can only exist if people actually put it into practice. That it is a psychological state, but it also has to be enacted. And then my definition, the expectation of no harm in a context where there is always the possibility of betrayal. Coming from an international relations background, I wanted to emphasize the importance of the possibility of betrayal because the costs and the consequences of that, of course, are so great in the international arena. It's great in any arena, but it's particularly great in the international arena. So a number of points jump out from this for me. First, trust always exists in a condition of uncertainty. And crucially, it's a device for managing that uncertainty and the anxieties it can generate. Because if we had certainty, we would not need trust. Second, trust always involves the risk, the possibility, as I say, that you end up having your trust disappointed or even betrayed. Third, trust is a mental or psychological state, cannot be observed directly, but it enables actions towards others that would not be possible in the absence of trust. Fourth, it's always in relation to someone or something. And then there's the question of who are the agents of trust. Can collectives trust or do individuals trust on behalf of collectives? What does it mean, for example, to talk about trust between two states? can trust at some levels of interaction coexist with an absence of trust or even distrust? Prime Minister Johnson and President Biden might not have a trusting relationship interpersonally, but the relationship between, say, the US intelligence, nuclear, and communities might be very trusting. So this idea of thinking about trust as a multidimensional concept and seeing it operating at lots of different levels, which is familiar, of course, from across the cross-disciplinary literature on trust, I think is important at the international level as well. But I think there's a lot of work often just moves between all these different references for trust without really specifying that. And I think that's one of the limitations of current international relations theorizing on trust. So how then do the rationalists think about trust, those that we come back to the costly signaling approach to trust? For Kidd, trust emerges out of a probabilistic risk calculation about the trustworthiness of others. Actors learn about the trustworthiness of others through strategic interaction, and as their trust grows, they send larger, costlier signals. The key point then is that trust is causally prior to the sending of those costly signals, though those signals in turn can strengthen trust. And it's this theory of calculative or strategic trust that I want to oppose with my own theory of bonding trust. So interpersonal bonding, what do we mean by this? The idea that actors can change their understanding of their own and the other's identity and interest through a process of positive and mutual identification. So I'm interested in how two rational egoists can be transformed into bonded partners through a process of social interaction, so that they make a positive identification with the security and welfare of the other. So social interactionist theory is at the heart of this. And the idea, so here I'm very much indebted to a constructivist way of thinking about the social world. And there are 4 stages to the theory. These are the 4 conditions that have to be present for bonding trust to take place. I'm going to talk about each one briefly. So the first and critically important precondition for the theory of bonding trust is that both actors have exercised security dilemma sensibility. Security dilemma sensibility is predicated on the idea that the other's behavior may be driven by fear and insecurity rather than malign intent. And crucially, the belief that one's own actions have contributed to the fear and insecurity of the other. So it's the antithesis of Weinberger's statement that the Soviets know they don't have to worry about the United States. It's a recognition that others are not so easily reassured. It's a concept that Ken Booth and I developed in our 2008 book, and it was aimed at trying to emphasize the importance of agency in security dilemma theorizing against what we saw as more structural accounts. Others had talked about the importance of empathy before, including preeminently Jervis, but at the same time, we felt that there was a structural argument there in a lot of the existing American theorizing about the security dilemma that was marginalizing the importance of agency, and we wanted to elevate that idea of agency to a central role. So we developed this concept to try and do that. The key question then becomes, if a leader or set of decision makers have developed this intuition of security dilemma sensibility, and I'll come back at the end of my lecture to say something about that, then how do they test that out? Or if it's a weak belief even, how do they test that out? And the argument that I pursue in my book is that they seek to test that out through the modality of face-to-face interaction. Because what they want to do is they want to communicate to their counterparts that they have exercised security dilemma sensibility, that they have put themselves in the shoes of their adversary, and that they understand that they've been doing things that have been increasing their fear and insecurity. And at the same time, they want to test out whether the other side is exercising security dilemma sensibility towards them. I don't make this clear enough in the book, but I do in later work with Marcus Holmes. But the idea here is that we get a situation of shared security dilemma sensibility. So if we arrive at that position where two leaders can communicate to each other that they have exercised security dilemma sensibility in relation to each other, then this is a critical moment for the possibilities of reassurance. But that's just the first stage, although it's absolutely pivotal. Next, and this is the Jervis book that I mentioned earlier, next, leaders seek through face-to-face interaction to acquire what I call an index of trustworthiness. I use this idea of the index from Jervis's 1970 book, The Logic of Images. An index for Jervis is a signal of inherent credibility about the future intentions of others. And I've modified this idea to argue that actors seek in face-to-face interaction an index of the other's trustworthiness. I've put there the ABI model, which I'm sure is familiar to everybody. And of course, the ability, benevolence, and integrity model. And it's the attributes that a trustor looks for in a trustee. And so I'm interested in how in face-to-face interaction, leaders acquire this index of trustworthiness of their counterparts. And here I make the argument strongly that face-to-face interaction provides unparalleled possibilities for intention understanding as actors give off signals that cannot be manipulated. So this idea from Goffman, and there I've cited Jari Milo's book and Holmes, of course, who's Marcus's 2018 book, which very much developed in parallel with mine, face-to-face diplomacy and social neuroscience and international relations, is a fantastic study of how face-to-face interaction provides decision makers with unparalleled opportunities for intentional understanding. And Marcus builds this argument around using neuroscience and the mirroring system in the brain to argue that face-to-face interaction provides an opportunity for intentional understanding in a way that isn't possible through any other modality of interaction. So the reciprocal exercise of security dilemma sensibility, the shared security dilemma sensibility, and acquiring an index of trustworthiness through face-to-face diplomacy, these are prior conditions for the development of interpersonal trust between two leaders, but they're not sufficient. Two other key components have to be actualized in social interaction for this relationship of bonding trust. What I call the positive identification of interests and humanization. The positive identification of interests refers to two leaders who see the other's interests as their own interests and the other's security and well-being as their own security and well-being. They don't necessarily have to share the same positions. Reagan and Gorbachev had very different positions on space-based missile defenses in relation to offensive nuclear arms reductions, and that's why they couldn't reach agreement in the end at Reykjavik in October '86. But I argue in my book in chapter 6, where I do a very detailed analysis, process tracing of the interpersonal interactions between the two leaders, that they shared a positive commitment to each other's security. So they did make this positive identification of interests with each other. And then the second component, humanization, refers to the process whereby two state leaders who meet face-to-face begin to see the human in their counterparts' attitudes and behavior, rather than just a representative of state interests. And of course, we have Gorbachev's famous line, the human factor, which I'll say a word about in a minute. So here they are, sitting in their easy chairs in Geneva in November 1985. This is, for me, is the best case we have of social bonding at the level of great power relations, but I'm open to being persuaded that there's a better one. The bonding process between Reagan and Gorbachev was evident in their first summit meeting. They shared some very human moments during the during the summit. Perhaps most poignantly, when Reagan suggested they go and get some fresh air and take a walk to the boathouse by the lake. Of course, it had all been choreographed in advance. The fire was all made up and everything. But nevertheless, they sat alone with interpreters for about 45 minutes to an hour here, talking about the possibilities for their future relationship. It was during their fireside chat that Reagan shared the view, one that's inspired my research for over a decade now, as to the potential for trust in interpersonal relationships at the top level of diplomacy to change for the better the prospects for peace. Gorbachev was very much taken with this, and he reflected when he walked back from his chat with Reagan by the fire that the human factor had quietly come into action. He remembered what he called a spark of electric mutual trust, which ignited between us. And Reagan wrote in his memoir that he left Geneva thinking that after almost 5 years, I'd finally met a Soviet leader I could talk to. Reagan had wanted to reach out from the beginning. He's often misunderstood, but I think a lot of the work that's come out now in the last 10 years and continuing to come out is giving us a very different role of Reagan to the one that I was seeing on my TV screens and in the early 80s when I was a student, and there were all these fears about nuclear war. It's a very different, much more complicated story. But here's the moment where he finally meets a Soviet leader he can work with. So I'm interested in exploring how actors come to reach a point. I'm conscious that I need to finish. I'm interested in exploring how actors come to reach a point where the calculation of risk no longer figures in their decisions vis-a-vis another actor. So the calculative approach to trust, the rationalist approach to trust, focuses on trust as risk calculation, probabilistic assessments of risk. I'm interested in what, at the point where that calculation of risk drops away. And the fundamental claim of my research is that if the process of social bonding between two individuals reaches a certain point, what I call identity transformation, then the mental or psychological state of trust on the part of these actors, but no one else, changes to what I call trust as suspension. Now, I borrow the language of suspension, of course, from Guido Mollering, his wonderful work. Guido and I have worked together for a long time now. He's a good friend. And I'm sure you all know his work very well. What I tried to do in Trusting Enemies was for the first time in international relations, apply this concept to the international level. And I argued the best case of trust as suspension at the international level was Reagan and Gorbachev's relationship during and after their summit meeting at Reykjavik, the year after the November meeting, where of course they came extraordinarily close to agreeing the abolition of their nuclear weapons. Now, just very quickly, I'm not saying that individuals who inhabit this mental state of suspension cannot be disappointed or even betrayed. The objective possibility of betrayal, hence my definition of trust, always exists because trust always takes place in conditions of risk and uncertainty. But for the individuals who inhabit a mental state of suspension, this is the critical point, such dangers are not factored into the decision-making process. But this doesn't mean that those leaders are not aware of them and the trust is somehow blind, because there'll be plenty of others in the government, as Reagan had with Weinberger, telling them that they are taking risks and behaving in a way which is dangerous to the national security of the state. So the third-party view of what is going on may be very different from those that are in the bonding process, who have gone through the bonding process. So the concept of trust as suspension is critical to my argument because it's this idea that unlocks the problem of accurate signal interpretation. It's the mental state of trust as suspension between two individuals that gives each the certainty, crucially this certainty can only ever be subjective, that their signals will be interpreted as intended. So that was a lot. I hope I've showed in this lecture that interpersonal trust between state leaders deserves much greater attention. This is because its presence and absence will have significant implications for the future course of key strategic relationships, as the world sadly plunges ever deeper into a new age of great power rivalry and conflict. The great value of face-to-face interaction is that it enables leaders and diplomats to read each other's trustworthiness, but it also creates an opening for leaders to fake their trustworthiness by faking bonds. As Andrew Kidd points out, untrustworthy leaders as well as trustworthy leaders go to summits. Let me conclude very quickly then by just reflecting on future directions for research. Since writing Trusting Enemies, I've published 2 articles with Marcus Holmes. The first in International Theory, which tried to develop a theory of how it is that social bond formation takes place when it does, because what I didn't do in my book was provide a theory for why these conditions, why these components, become operative sometimes and not other times. In the book, Holmes and I have started writing, drawing on microsociology, including crucially Randall Collins's work on interaction ritual chains. We're trying to address that fundamental question of why it is that some leaders hit it off when other encounters fall flat or even lead to negative emotional energy. And if you're interested, the article in International Theory from 2020 is where we set out the theory of diplomatic social bonding using Collins's framework and developing and applying it to international relations. The second area I'd point to is the question of how far social bonding and trust can develop in non-face-to-face interaction. Randall Collins has argued that there's something fundamental about bodily co-presence. And here we're having this meeting now over Zoom. And if I was sitting with you in Frankfurt, the emotional energy, hopefully, would be more, we'd have a different experience. Now we're getting an experience, but we'd have a different one. And the question is whether bodily co-presence is essential for social bonding and trust development, or can it develop virtually? And this is clearly a really important question, because only yesterday, of course, Putin met with Biden virtually. And of course, only a few weeks ago, he met with Xi Jinping virtually. So this question of whether we can generate trust through non-face-to-face interaction, I think is an absolutely fundamental one. And one of the ways Marcus and I have tried to address that was we wanted to go back and we looked at whether you could develop trust through letter writing and through the exchange of letters. And we looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis and the letters exchanged between Kennedy and Khrushchev in those crucial days, and argued that they played an important role in developing that shared security dilemma sensibility I talked about, and a weak form of trust, not suspension, that helped them to defuse the crisis. I can say more about that in discussion if people are interested. And then the third area, and this really I think is kind of where it gets very interesting for me, is that although I thought security dilemma sensibility was critical to the process, I think I've realized since I wrote the book that actually it's really fundamental, because how does that security dilemma sensibility develop in relationships of distrust? And in my case studies, I have a narrative story of how this happened or didn't happen, but I don't have a theory of the conditions under which security dilemma sensibility develops and how it can develop in distrusting relationships. And this is what I'm now working on. In a project with Mark Saunders from the Birmingham Business School, who's a major trust scholar. I'm sure many of you have read his work, and one of my PhD students, Chiara Cavasio. And this is where the distrust kind of dissolving agenda comes in, because it's a really interesting sort of conclusion, I think, that we've reached, which is that there's a fundamental difference between trust building processes and distrust dissolving ones. Once we take the view that trust and distrust are different concepts, different constructs with different antecedents, we get different strategies and associated interventions following from that. And finally, I want to end by just mentioning what I think is the biggest challenge to all of this, which is the future uncertainty problem. The realists are always going to be on hand to wield this argument against these kind of discussions that I've had tonight. If bonding trust is dependent on particular leader-to-leader constellations, then ultimately, how much can you build on that? How much can you build national security planning on that? We think of Trump's withdrawal from Paris, INF, to realize the power of this objection. So the question is, how do you build a bridge from interpersonal trust to embedding that trust in wider institutionalized frameworks and arrangements, and ultimately in societies. So it's building a bridge from interpersonal trust to the development of security communities, the Deutschian concept, of course, which I think is a really powerful one. Seems to me to be one of the fundamental challenges that those of us who think interpersonal trust is critical have to be able to have a good answer to. I'll stop there and look forward to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I overran a bit.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts on with us. And I would like to open directly the list for comments or questions.